And cities are the center of all that stuff that is growing. And so if we as a church don't sort of connect there somewhere, we are going to lose out. We cannot use a model to do missions that belongs to an era that was 100 years old. It's just not going to work. And we all know that. People in their minds as well, non-believers, we're talking particularly what we will call in business your target market, is not the same as the target market of 100 years ago. And I probably could pitch somewhere, if you want to look back, where was the golden age of missions? It was probably about 1910. I think it was the Edinburgh Conference of Missions. That was probably then came the thing, that conference was spoken about that we would finish world evangelization within a generation. Well, we're sitting several generations on now, and the task is as hard as it was then. So what happened? Well, the first thing that happened was the First World War came along, and all this ideological thought that we're going to Christianize the world went out in 4 short years. And with that, the world changed, people changed. The First World War had a greater impact on the world than most people imagine. And there's some very good books on that, if you want to. There are some in the library, some recent work done, a book called The Holy War. And where Christians went to war with Christians, and that shattered this ideological perspective that we are going to Christianize the world. How could Christians who were trying to Christianize the world just 4 years prior now kill each other in their millions on an industrial scale? What happened? And there's a lot of arguments around it, but that's not what we're going to go into today. But what it did do was change the world. And we're sitting with the ramifications of those changing. The world became increasingly non-Christian from that point. Now, when I say non-Christian, yes, we've got the 2/3 world where there's a great growth in Christianity. But how do you measure Christianity? That's the key. Because we can talk nominal Christians. If we look nominally, we're very Christian in the world. But if we look as Christ's disciples, how are we doing? There's a big difference. And if you look around you, your older, more Christian countries, your Christendom, which was your north, was Europe and North America, are declining at a very great rate. You can pick up any good studies on it recently, and Christendom is declining in those countries. I use the word Christendom, not Christians. In the south, it's growing, but it's not growing to the degree and the extent and the depth as it should. And I think that's where we come in this classroom here this morning. We look at what can we do where there is still a hunger and a yearning for the gospel in the south, what we call the global south. How do we link onto it? But not just while people's hearts are open to Christ, how do we disciple them from that point of salvation? I think it's been one of the biggest weaknesses of the global south. Now that's all part of missions. Missions is not bringing people to salvation. Missions is bringing people to become disciples of Christ. It's the Great Commission. So it's a lot deeper. If you want disciples, you become a Muslim. You have to just recite whatever they recite 3 times and you become a Muslim. Christianity doesn't work like that. Christ clearly calls us to be disciples. And that impacts of how we plant churches. Because church planting is not a hit and run. Church planting is always a long-term process. Because you've got to build the gospel and the scriptures into people's lives when you plant a church. You're not making converts, you're making disciples. So I just wanted to put up, is this thing connected now? Put up a couple of slides. Folk, my little talk is just going to be around the background as to why we need to focus on urban missions. Is this thing not working?
It's switched on.
Okay, all right. It should come up now in a moment. We'll look at inner cities with a specific focus of church planting. But I want to also highlight that inner cities inner city, you never have clear boundaries. So you've got 5 types of churches which I'm going to talk about. No, that's not what I'm looking for. Where's the... But also, I need help. Is it on?
Was there and it went away.
No, it's not a happy chappy now this morning for some reason. Oh. At least we're under the cross. This is your PowerPoint.
Yeah, just
Switch off.
let's try and drag it.
Okay, let me just start it again.
So,
Yeah. Just It was up this morning.
yeah. Is it this one?
Yeah. There we go. It doesn't want to do yet. Goes
Let
up
me
there.
find it to the source where it is.
Okay.
Help you.
Okay, well, I'll also just give me a hand out. I'm going to hand out some basic notes, if you guys don't mind. These are basic notes. They are not a book, and they are not scientific, but it's just my heart and my thoughts on some stuff over the years. If you don't mind, you can just grab it. And we can just talk our way through these notes as we go along. Is there another one here? It was up just
There we
now.
go.
Okay.
Slideshow,
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Poloso. All right, folk, what I want us to talk about is when we talk urban, when we talk missions and inner city missions, we also talk in urban missions. Now, how many of you folk have been involved in inner city missions? Can I just get a show of hands? Even if you've just been there for a short time, you'll know, okay. Because there are 5 churches, types of churches in the Baptist Union, and this is what I want to start it out as. Does God have a heart for city churches? Yes, He does. Because if we look at city churches, we know, of course, He spoke about that great city, Nineveh. You can read the story of Jonah, where it says, "And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, where there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left," which hasn't changed since Nineveh, "and also much cattle." In other words, the whole economy of the city. God cares about cities. Now, cities, first of all, are not buildings either. Cities are pictured as buildings, but cities are people. It's the same as a church. It's not a building. A church is people. It's the same principle. Now, when we talk about these types of churches you will find in the Baptist Union, there are 3 of them particularly that apply to inner city or to city or urban ministry. And those are the ones I want to talk about. But I need to put a backdrop to this. And this is basic stuff. It's not detailed, but I want you to get a picture of where we are as a world, as a universe. And we are moving into what we call an urban universe very, very fast. Actually, we've urbanized. There's no turning back. People said COVID will slow down urbanization. It hasn't. It's actually accelerated it. Actually, urbanization took place quicker after COVID. It made up for the pace that COVID perhaps put a hold on it. So urbanization is something that's going to happen whether you and I like it or not. And the church has to go where people are going. So you cannot live in a little world that I want to do missions in my way, but the world is going in a different direction to what your romantic view of missions is. You are going to miss the boat from a ministry point of view. You will not find yourself effective as a missionary. The other thing with mission work is that pastors, if you took urbanization as pastors, we all become missionaries in some way, because the urban world changes the mission field. So when you become a pastor, there's days when you went to a church and you stayed there for 30 years and you had a lovely little, warm little ministry that went along and it paid the salaries and paid the bills and everybody sang kumbaya every day in the church, etc., and you retired. Those days are gone. If you're going to go look for a church out there like that, you're not going to find it. The world is getting harsher towards Christianity, and the world is becoming a lot more difficult to penetrate as a church. And so it's hard work. That's really what I'm trying to tell you. You cannot relax and expect your church to grow. And Jesus speaks about that, of course, in the churches to Revelation. He says that type of thing. Don't take your foot off the gas, as they say in America, Kurt. Don't take your foot off the gas. You need to know where you're going with this thing called the church. And you're a pastor of that church. And increasingly you're becoming what we call a pastor missionary. And we cannot escape that. Urbanization is a reality. If you look at urbanization, we spoke about the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, 2 out of every 10 people were in cities. In actual fact, I think it was a very even smaller than that, but that's just a rounded off number. 1900, only 2 out of every 10 people. The rest were all rural or in rural settings, small villages. By the year where we are around about now, in 2010, it crossed 50% for the first time of people now living in cities. In our own lifetime, most of us sitting here, Bishop, maybe you and I won't make it, but the rest of the guys should be. By 2050, we're going to be looking at 7 out of every 10. So in our lifetime, we're going to have, say, call it 3 out of every 4 people living in an urban situation. I don't use the word cities because I'll explain that to you as well, because cities are not going to be cities either. They're becoming mega cities and what we call meta cities. So urban conglomerations. Now that, just the thinking of this for a moment, this picture here, it's a picture I often use. When you've worked in the inner city, Raphael, you'll know. You see the people coming in the buses with their stuff on their heads. I worked with Raphael for a couple of years in Yeovil. The influx of people just coming continually to settle. And where do they settle? They settle in the inner city to start with 9 times out of 10. Coming like that lady into the city, looking for a better life. For either from the rural areas of our own country or from up in Africa or wherever. There's a great move, a mass exodus back into cities or into cities for the first time. So we're going to look at, if you ever thought that mission work must be focused anything other than urban areas, we are mistaken. Big time. We've got to look at our cities as the new mission field. And actually, we should have started looking probably 10 or 15, 20 years ago already. I remember Kurt was involved. Kurt, I remember you were talking about it a while back already. I don't think people have quite caught the vision sometimes yet. And I think Kurt will probably talk more to that than I will. But we've got to change the way we look at mission fields. It's become urban. We cannot escape it. It's not going to change. And the cities become what we call gateways for the gospel. Because people are flooding into the cities, cities are where the gospel's got to be presented. Now what that does is 2 things. One, it makes it easier for us. It doesn't make it less costly. We always think that going to the rural areas and becoming a mission worker in some far-flung place is more costly. It's actually not. It can be as expensive to plant churches in a city than in a rural area. Probably more expensive sometimes. But there are gateways. People are coming through the gates of the city in a sense, and at those gates we should be ready with the gospel as they arrive. We should be reaching out to these. And every day 180,000 people migrate to the cities. Every day. Every year 70 million people reach the cities. Now you want to think about that for a moment. You're planting every year a urban conglomeration of 70 million people. What's the biggest cities in the world? I don't know, conglomerations. Just think about the scale of that for a moment, of how many people are hitting cities every day and every year. And what are our churches, and I'm talking particularly Baptists this morning, but I'm talking broader than that too. We're not only talking Baptists here. How are we prepared to receive 180,000 people coming to our cities every day? We're not. We're very badly prepared for that. In actually, we want to protect what we got. And when you're talking urban mission, you've got to actually throw the doors open. It takes a big change of understanding that you cannot have this lovely, beautiful church building with its steeple. And I know I was at Troyville, had a beautiful church building with a steeple. By the way, that steeple was hit by lightning one year. And I had a piece of that steeple in my office for many years, where the lightning actually went right through the metal of the steeple. Now, I don't know if God was speaking. I don't believe that God speaks like that. But believe me, you cannot just take that thought away. Did God say something? And we had to repair the steeple because we sometimes focus so much on protecting this beautiful building that we miss the beautiful people. And I say that sounds like a bit of a cliche, but you know what I'm saying. We've got to use our facilities to reach people, not to protect the facility. And I find that amongst many of our churches, we so want to make a church comfortable. Folk, Christ never promised us a comfortable life in the church. Find that in the Bible and prove me wrong. Christ challenges us when we join the church to go out and get our hands dirty, be challenged by the people that we're reaching out to, become messy in the world. That is what he challenges. You're going to find obstacles, he tells us. Again and again he warns us. It's hard work to work amongst people and bring them to Christ. We're not to build pretty places. We are to go out and evangelize the world, and that's not easy. Paul certainly lived a tough life as an evangelist. And if you look in Paul's writings in Acts chapter 18, as far away as Acts when he was on his missionary journeys, Paul already then was going from city to city. Paul did not go from farmhouse to farmhouse. He did not go from village to village. If you find that in the Bible again, show me. He went where he could be effective and where the gospel could grow the quickest and the fastest and make the deepest penetration, and where the gospel could change culture. And where does culture get changed? In the cities. Farmers don't change culture, folk. Cities change culture. And even more so today than ever before. Listen to Paul. Acts chapter 18 and 1 to 3. First of all, he wrote letters, by the way, to Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, Thessalonica. Those were all cities. All important cities of his day. But listen to what he says. And after this, Paul left Athens. Where did he leave? Athens. So Paul himself was a traveler from city to city. Athens was the heart of philosophy, of thinking of his day. Made a major impact on the way people thought about religion in Athens. Athens was one of those centers of philosophical and religious thought. So where does he go? He goes where you can make a difference. The city of Athens. After staying there, he leaves and he goes to Corinth. What is Corinth? Corinth was one of the commercial hubs of the Roman Empire. A major trading city. A city very similar to a Johannesburg today. If you could compare Johannesburg to any city in the New Testament, probably Corinth would be one of those that you could compare it to. Dirty, messy, a lot of money, people making a life for themselves. He goes there because it impacts the culture. If you're going to make an impact in the world, you go to places where things are happening. Johannesburg is one of those cities. In the African context, it has a major part to play in how Christianity is viewed. It's a gateway to many other parts of Africa and the world. And he founded a Jew called Aquila, or named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who recently came from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So there's Rome mentioned in that same verse. Rome was the political center of the universe of Paul's day. So in those two or three little verses, he talks of the three major cities which he's connected with in some way. And of course, we know Paul eventually ends up in Rome. And as he went to see them, because they were the same trade, and he stayed with them, and he worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And so you'll see he touches on all the major important, and it's the same for us today. How are we touching on the important urban areas of our day to make a difference? And now, folks, you cannot change the whole city, but you've got to change where God has placed you in the city. And so we need to look at our cities are changing. Coming back to Johannesburg, 1994, Johannesburg. I arrived here in 1995. I came to live in Joburg. The Joburg, and we're talking the greater Joburg city, not the whole of Gauteng and that now. We're just talking Joburg as a city. It had 2.4 million people. By last year, that had grown to 6.2 million. Now, do you know why we got potholes and leaking sewage pipes and water problems and road problems and housing problems and electricity problems? Do you understand why cities get to that place? Because those nearly 4 million extra people that have arrived in the last 20-odd years, 28 years, haven't contributed to the city yet. Most of them are coming in at a very low level of economic, how could I put it? They're not contributing as they should. They're not paying the rates and taxes. They're not paying. So your city is sucking people in, but they're not getting anything from them until they find their feet economically, eventually. And then they will begin to contribute. So in the meantime, the city government or the city fathers have to try and cope with keeping the city going, with people flooding in that are not contributing. And that is the story of cities all around the world, by the way, especially in your south. And that is why cities are struggling. They look messy and they look dirty, like Joburg does. And your approach to this is, do we run away from that? Do we try and change that? But that's not our job. Our job is to evangelize. But the backdrop, and what I'm painting is a backdrop. A messy city is messy sometimes because it's beyond. It's not because the local government does not care. It's because the local government often gets overwhelmed and they can't cope. And the church has got a place to play in that, by the way. If you're working in the inner city particularly, you've got a place. You will find yourself not just working purely from a gospel point of view. You will work in conjunction with social NGOs and NPOs and things around you all the time, government organizations. Because you don't only lift up the gospel, but when you lift up the gospel, you lift up people along with the gospel. You see that they need to be housed properly, they need to be fed properly, watered properly. The streets need to be safe. That is all part of putting God's kingdom and lifting up God's kingdom in a society. So you cannot divorce, and you'll find that again and again, you cannot divorce the social side of the gospel from the actual spiritual side of the gospel because of these problems of people flooding into the cities. I want to read you some stuff. It's in this little book. By the way, if you want some good books, a good starter on it is Stephen Buzzard on Why Cities Matter. So if you haven't read it, it's worth reading through. It's a basic book. It's not a doctrinal thesis or anything like that. It's just a basic thing of how God, culture, and the church fit together in a city. And it's really worth getting hold of and reading. I've read this several times, but Buzzard, and it's obviously centered around North America, but it applies to all cities. Cities are universal in many aspects. And then read widely, and I'm going to come to this now as well in a moment. Read widely on your city. Understand your city, because you cannot penetrate your city with the gospel unless you understand your city. Now, Al Moller wrote an article, and I've got the full article in this notes at the back, it's in the first addendum, but I just want to pick up a few things about what this article said about cities, just to read it, just flow over you and get a background again. And it says the 21st century will not be dominated by America or China or Brazil or India, but by the city. In an age that appears increasingly unmanageable, and that's what we're seeing. We're looking at this and we're saying, but listen, the city's falling apart around us. Things are falling apart around us. We're clinging to them by the skin of our teeth. Cities, rather than states, are becoming islands of government or governance on which the future world order will be built. Now, this is nothing new. City-states go back in history, they were often city-states. I mean, Jericho, think of Jericho, was a city-state in many ways. So those types of cities were. By the way, what's the oldest city in the world? The oldest inhabited city in the world? Continuously inhabited city in the world? City. Jerusalem. No, Jerusalem came quite late in the scene. Cairo, no. Eh? Damascus, that's right. Damascus is your oldest, and it's part of the biblical story, right, from the beginning to the end. Damascus is there, and it's the oldest, so according to archaeology, and that is the oldest or the longest lived-in city continuously without having been abandoned at some point. Nineveh was abandoned, Babylon disappeared, Jericho disappeared, came back later on again. Jerusalem was destroyed several times. So we're talking about a continued inhabitants. Damascus, interestingly enough. So some cities have got long lives. But cities are the center of global gravity, expanding their influence confidently beyond outward in a borderless world. In other words, your New Yorks and your Londons used to be very key players. It wasn't America and UK, it was New York, London. It's the center of finance or the center of banking were those two cities. And it goes on. And so he talks about, in this article by Al Moller, and I'm just going to pick up a few points from it. We are becoming a city planet. Vast populations are moving into huge international cities drawn by the hope of a better life. And by the way, every one of those folk that came in here came because there was a hope of a better life. In the Bible, cities are there to give you safety, security, friendship, neighbors. They had the safe cities of Israel in Numbers 35, I think it is, the refuge cities. It's there to give you refuge. When you're in trouble, you go to a city. When you get attacked, you draw back into a city. Cities are meant to give you hope and security, but they don't. It's a false hope and a false security. So it doesn't really, it can if it's run properly, but it's generally not. So even as you go to Johannesburg, part of those 4 million people come, you're looking for a better life, you're looking for hope, looking for security that the rural world can't give you. And you find when you come to the city, it's as dicey and as risky as anywhere else. Except you've got access to a lot more in a city. Food supplies, government assistance, etc., etc. So cities have got their place. Drawn by the hope of a better life, as Brand notes, cities have always been wealth creators. Johannesburg is built on greed. We sit in a city that is built on gold, what's under our feet. They're still having fights with the Zama still today over what's under our feet. It's greed, money. It's a city that, by the way, it's the biggest city in the world that doesn't have a mountain, doesn't have a seafront, and doesn't have a river running through it. It's built entirely on what is under our feet. And yet it draws millions of people still hoping to find. So when you understand how cities operate, it makes it easier for us to minister into those places. All right? Cities have always been wealth creators, with exploding populations of the larger cities drawing even more inhabitants with the hope of securing economic futures. At the current rate, Brand writes, humanity may well be 80% urban by mid-century. We saw those figures. Every week there are 1.3 million new people in cities. That's 70 million a year, decade after decade. And then he goes to talk about cities, where London was the biggest city in the world in the late 1800s at 1 million people. 1 million people now is a dormitory city. Soweto is bigger than 1 million people. A lot bigger. So your whole idea of cities are no longer just measured in millions. They now begin to measure in tens of millions, even perhaps hundreds of millions in a city into the future. That makes mission fields very different when we start talking those numbers. Now you understand why we're talking about this stuff. And when you come out of this college, if you're a college student and you want to go into ministry and into missions, your traditional view of the church is going to alter in your generation. And unless we as Baptists catch on to that, we're going to be left behind. We'll become irrelevant with our nice little safe churches in suburbs, where it's all we want to look is a suburban church. We certainly won't be fulfilling the Great Commission. In the 1950s, there were only two cities classified as megacities. They were London and New York. Then Tokyo came along as the third megacity. Of that, only Tokyo is left in the north. Every other megacity is, guess where, is in the south, where we find ourselves. To earn a place in the top 10, cities will soon need to boast a population of 20 million or more. This is a new breed of city. They call it the meta city. The city, megacity, meta city. In other words, the city's influence is so great that it gets that picture of meta, which means overarching. It overrides everything. Its influence is beyond its size. The new meta cities, far larger than the megacities, will include Tokyo, along with Mumbai, Shanghai, Jakarta, Beijing, Karachi, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Lagos, And then Kinshasa came on the radar recently as well. So 2 of those in Africa. Joburg actually doesn't feature that highly in that. But there are, if you go to Lagos, who's been to Lagos? Yeah. It's very different. You've been to Cairo, where I saw them picking cars up to find parking. They literally pick the car up and move it sideways. Yeah. You know, then you understand overcrowding and mega cities. That's where the church has got to go, to that mess, that density. That's where the mission fields are. Then it talks about Lagos. And if you've been to Lagos, you'll understand this picture. Lagos, Nigeria may well point to the new urban future in all its promise and peril, because it's a promise of great wealth. At what peril? As the Financial Times acknowledges, Lagos is a city that forces us to confront our fears of what will happen if we do not sort out our cities. Joburg's going there fast, guys. Why? Lagos has become the cipher for the urban nightmare. A city without structure, infrastructure, social provision, amenities or basic property rights for its citizens. In other words, the growth is so fast that you cannot keep up. And so there's no longer just a city with high density in the middle of the city. There's now a city that is high density from the edges of the city to the center. Everybody living cheek by jowl in a high density situation. In cities like Lagos, citizens have to work to carve out their niche in a city that does not care. Have you tried to phone the Joburg municipality lately? Cities do not care. They cannot. They haven't got time to care. Get on with it. Citizens have to work to carve out their niche in a city that does not care. These vast cities are growing without planning, without adequate services, without the social institutions that reinforce civic order. Now you see where the church comes in. It does have a part to play in all that. They are expanding through the emergence of vast slums and areas of virtually no civic government. They are drawing populations by the multiple billions. And rather by following the American pattern of a dense city core, an inner city, with far less density in surrounding suburbs, these cities are marked by constant density. That's what I was trying to say. There's constant. Folk, in the city, yeah, we can see it. If you've worked in the inner city, yes, the inner city, Hillbrow, Joburg inner city used to be the dense core of people living. But it's now pushed out to the Troyvilles and the Kensingtons of the world, to the Rosettenvilles of the world. That dense living has hit what we call the old suburbs. The suburbs have now become high density. And so when you go into a house, I'll never forget going into a house when I first got to Troyville. Just across the road, we went and knocked on doors, doing door-to-door evangelism, taking food parcels. And I came from a background where it was urban, suburban. So you go, there were 3 or 4 food parcels, and you go and you see, you can visit 3 or 4 houses. You get to the first house, and we knocked on the door, and there were 60 people living in that house. And when I said, can I speak to this? They all gathered in the backyard. It was like a church. It was actually more people in my church as some mornings. One house, across the road from the church. It was eye-opening. People were sleeping in the pantries. The guy would put his mattress up in the pantry, and in the morning he just pulls it down. Whichever he's working, she was working shifts, so he slept in the day and he pushed it up at night. So those type of things, that's high density. It's actually beyond high density. It's uncontrolled high density. Now, when you're ministering into that, the needs of those people are very different to a suburban person you're ministering to. And that's where the growth is in the cities. So you have to adjust the way you think and minister to these folk. Otherwise you miss the point. You cannot go through one little bag of tea and bread. You've got to go with something more meaningful to those people. What can you offer that is meaningful to those people right across the road from your church? It's a dense inner core. And he goes on to say, put in the urban by the way, there's been this argument, and this is very interesting. I want you to understand that we've gone past the tipping point of ever going back from cities. So anybody who's got this picture, we'll all become rural again. Those days are gone. In Brazil, we have the favelas, which are your informal settlements. They are vast in terms of numbers. And there was an argument put a while back is, why don't we take the folk, give them all a piece of government land and put them back on the land to take care of themselves? Do you know that if you had to do that, you would have to take out most of the rainforests in Brazil. Most of them. They'll be gone. There will be no more rainforest. We ain't going back to the rural guys. We are urban, and we are staying urban as a world. If the Christian church does not learn new modes of urban ministry, we will find ourselves on the outside looking in. The gospel of Jesus Christ must call a new generation of committed Christians into these teeming cities. As these new numbers make clear, there is really no choice. So as a union of churches, as a Baptist union, we don't have a choice. We have to look at the cities. It's forced upon us. That's where our mission focus has to go. I was going to touch on a few more other things quickly. While I was doing this, and it started about 2 years ago, I had the privilege of getting around South Africa since I was at the Baptist Union. And I started seeing the churches literally every corner of this country. Literally. I was up in northern Natal a month or two back, May. And we went up into up to the Mozambique border, into the most rural of places that very few people would actually go. You actually need a bucky to get to some of the churches. And actually, you can't even find the church unless someone knows where they are, because you go into the bush. I mean, that's as bad as that. It was very interesting. What I've come across, there are 5 types of churches or church streams that you'll find in South Africa. And I use this quite often in my own ministry because it makes me understand where a church that I'm dealing with fits into the spectrum. You've got your suburban churches. And by the way, I've written at the back of this little book, there's a little definition of each of them. It's my thoughts focused, not a scientific article, but it's my observations. And you'll find it interesting. And why am I highlighting this? Because you get suburban churches, township churches. You also get your rural small town churches, your inner city churches. And this is a very interesting one. Your transitioning church. It's your church that is changing from its old traditional city type church in the suburb into a high density church. Now these are all very different, and I've put it in and I've measured them according to LSM. And if you know what LSM is, it's your lifestyle standard measurement, which measures what is the income or what do people spend their money on in churches. And it comes back to my old corporate days, but it just gives me an idea of how to measure those churches financially and what they've got in their houses, because that gives you a picture of who we're dealing with. If you're going to go and minister in any city church, leaving the rural out at the moment, you have to know what church you're going into. You cannot take the gospel as a shotgun and shoot it off and hope to hit something. Because you can't plant a church like that. You've got to know who you're dealing with, what the area you're planting a church in, and what you're going to find in that area. So if you're going to go plant a church in the suburban area, you need to know how do suburban people think. And you can read it at the back of the book for yourself. Township church is very unique to South Africa, but no real difference to the favelas of Brazil. Same thing. So the same problems you'll have here that will be there. Access is a problem, bad infrastructure, and all this, you'll read it in there. Your inner city churches are general inner city churches anywhere in the world, but the one that I really want us to look at as a Baptist Union in the future is this one. That's where we are falling short, is in your transitioning churches. Transitioning churches are where you've got 2 churches in one. I call them double congregations. You've got your old congregation with your money and your leadership, and you've got your new congregation coming in. How do you bring those 2 together? The biggest challenge in our country is going to be amongst these guys. That one. But read it for yourself. I haven't got time to go. It's a whole topic on its own. And then just very quickly, because my time is up. Inner city ministries as mission fields. What makes a mission field? A mission field is when you cross culture and you cross language. That's the definition of a mission. In the inner city, you're doing that every day. Because of the vast number of cultures that are coming into the inner city, or in your transitional churches, you're crossing culture every day. Your cities, those churches are cross-cultural. They are multicultural. And they've also got language barriers. So you might decide to preach in French or in English, but there are multiple other languages. And are people hearing clearly the gospel message? So how are you reaching people with the gospel? The mission fields, in terms of the inner city, instead of going to the mission field very quickly, they come to us. So the mission fields are washing up on our doorstep. instead of us having to go thousands of kilometers to find those same folk maybe a generation ago. There are hostile environments. Just like a mission field in rural areas is generally hostile, the inner city is a very hostile environment. People are not welcomed in the city because they're already overcrowded. Another busload arrives, you're not welcome. You have these outbreaks of xenophobia on a regular basis because it's a hostile environment. You're taking away what I've got if more and more people are added into that environment. And the church has got a part to play in that. Because at Troyville, I don't know about Rosettenville and Bellevue, but you know, often the people would come there and they stand with their family in their bags because of xenophobia. What do I do? It's unique. You don't face that problem in a suburban city. And this is the thing that we did particularly at Troyville. Your church must become that pool of peace. That in that mess of what we call high density living, is there a place that people can draw aside to? Where they can find acceptance, where they can find care, compassion, even material, even on a small material level, some assistance, food, place to sleep, and ultimately will they find the true peace, which is the gospel. Because through those things, you will reach them with the gospel. And we tell you, a lot of the folk that we led to the Lord at Troyville over the years, and there weren't hundreds and thousands, we didn't, but those that we did, they came to us because they needed help. And we did the long walk, the discipleship walk with them to know Christ. And I can tell you, some of those folks changed and have gone back to other parts of Africa now and still keep in contact with me. And they're now in leadership of churches all over the continent. Now, it's not hundreds of people. I wish it was more. But we made a difference when we could. And that's all that we're asking. You need help. Inner city churches can't survive without the help of the suburban churches. We call it the buddy-up system. I'll come back to it. And from college students, I want you to start thinking about when you leave here. Don't just think of going to your suburban church on the corner where you came from. Think of going in where God is really needing you and where you are really needed with that gospel, where you can make a difference. Now, we all know that Christ builds his church and it's Christ's gospel and the Holy Spirit works, but he works through us. So he will call you and I to some place. Don't only listen for the comfortable call. I spent most of the last 20 years in the inner city. I started with Raphael over there. And Pastor Raphael taught me a tremendous amount in the inner city. We planted that church in Bellevue, or Pastor Raphael did, and I worked with him for a while. It is the most rewarding type of work that you'll find in the inner city. The last few points I'll go through very quickly. The inner city, what are the characteristics? Diversity. Don't think that you got your model for evangelism and the gospel and your theology all worked out. Into your city, or into your church, in the city is going to come Catholics, Zionists, Shembe, and they're all going to flood in there and they're going to sit there and they're going to start asking a lot of questions in your church. That's just the nature of the inner city church. And you can't just say, well, I only believe in John MacArthur, and that's all I will teach. You'll doom yourself to failure. All right. You've got to be diverse and able to deal with diversity. I'm not saying you must change the gospel. I'm not saying you must change your theology. I'm not saying you must even, the scripture's got to be dead center of everything and authority of everything. But you've got to be able to deal with diversity. All right. It's transient. Don't think you're going to build a 1,000-seater church in the inner city, because people don't stay in the inner city. The minute they find their feet economically, where do they go? To the nearest suburb. So you're always going to have a transient church. You'll have a core leadership. It'll stick around. But your church will always be transient. People will come and people go. And here's your role as a pastor. What do you do with those people when they're with you, whether it's for 6 months or 2 years or whatever? Do you make disciples out of them? That's your calling as a pastor. Buddy up, you need help from the outside. You cannot do the inner city work. You need to call on outside organizers. Buildings, you don't need a church with a steeple. You can meet in a church, you can meet in a shop, you can meet, it allows you more freedom. If you've got a building, be blessed, because those buildings become very expensive, ask me. Youth, in Troyville certainly, in Bellevue, 50% of the people under the age of 25. If you want to reach the youth of our country, inner city is where you've got to go. And you're going to have to compete with all the other stuff that's competing for them. Your social ministry becomes very strong. SOUP, what is it? Soap, Soup and Salvation of the Salvation Army. They learned that already in Victorian London, in the slums there. It's the same. You cannot just say to be blessed, my brother, as John says, and he goes away cold and hungry. You have to come alongside people to make the gospel real. And lastly, folk, if you're even thinking of going into the inner city, it's uncomfortable. It's not an easy ministry. It's difficult. It's high risk. It's not safe always, and you never feel like you're on top of it. And you're going to get called out at 10 o'clock into Hillbrow and go up the Flatsay, and you've got to do it. You're the pastor. If you're not prepared to do that, don't go there. I'm brutally honest. But if you do take that step, you're going to find great blessing. Daryl, I've overspent my time. I hope that just gave you a bit of a picking.
Thank you very, very much. Let's keep going. Shall we stand for a moment? We've got Dr. Terrell Manacom now who's going to be sharing with us on exploring inner city dynamics after that. Outreach in word and deed. And Dr. Terrell's tackling the issue of how do we marry this? Because in the past there's been a strong emphasis on just share the gospel. How do we not just share the gospel, but also have a concern for the society in which we live? So Dr. Terrell will come to us with our answering some of the theological questions behind what we're doing. And we want to give Dr. Terrell a warm round of applause. Shall we stand?